At the start of the 1930s, just 8% of American households owned an electric refrigerator. Most families did not have one at all until after World War II. Think about what that means. No refrigerator, no freezer, winter in rural Ohio or Tennessee or Nebraska lasting 5 or 6 months. A family of 5 with no grocery store within reasonable reach and no money to spare, even if there were. And yet they ate. Through every winter, through the Depression, through drought years and hard years and years when the harvest came in thin. They ate because they had a system, a layered, deliberate, room by room and jar by jar system of food preservation that began in late summer and carried a family through to the following spring. The root cellar was the center of it. But the cellar was never the whole story. This is how that system worked, and why almost no one uses it anymore. Before mechanical refrigeration, the enemy of food was temperature, too much of it in summer, too little of it in winter, and the wrong kind at the wrong time either way. Heat bred bacteria. Hard freeze burst cell walls and destroyed texture and taste. The ideal was something in between, consistently cool, not frozen, with enough moisture in the air to prevent shriveling. The Earth solves this problem on its own. Dig down 10 feet into the ground in almost any part of the continental United States, and the temperature stabilizes somewhere between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The surrounding soil insulates against summer heat and against winter freeze. It holds moisture naturally. It is dark and still. A root cellar is simply a structure that exploits this principle. Dug into a hillside or excavated beneath a house, lined with stone or brick or logs, and fitted with a ventilation system to draw off the gases that ripening vegetables produce. It was not a complicated piece of engineering. It was a practical response to a practical problem, refined over generations until it worked reliably. The National Park Service documented that the Farm Security Administration and the Office of War Information actively encouraged Americans to build and restock their root cellars during the Depression and the years of World War II. This was not nostalgia. It was survival infrastructure. And the families who had maintained it came through those decades better fed than those who had not. Temperature needs to hold between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That range is cold enough to slow the growth of microorganisms and the release of ripening gases, but it stays above the freezing point that turns stored vegetables to mush. Humidity needs to stay between 85 and 90%. Below that, stored produce will shrivel and dry out. Above it, mold takes hold. Most root cellars had dirt floors, not because the builders could not afford concrete, but because bare earth holds moisture naturally and can be dampened further by wetting it down in dry spells. The floor was part of the humidity system. Ventilation was managed with 2 small vents, one low and one high, on opposite sides of the cellar. Cool air entered from the low vent, circulated through the space, and carried off ethylene gas through the high vent. Ethylene is what fruits and some vegetables emit as they ripen. Left to accumulate, it accelerates the ripening of everything around it. Managed with ventilation, it dissipated harmlessly. A well-designed root cellar could be divided into zones, one zone slightly cooler and drier for onions and garlic, another damper and colder for potatoes and carrots, and a third for apples kept separate from everything else, because apples produce more ethylene than almost any other stored crop and will push their neighbors to ripen and rot faster if placed too close. A family who built this right and stocked it in autumn could keep potatoes for 5 to 8 months. Carrots buried in damp sand lasted through spring. Winter squash stored on slatted shelves, never touching each other, never stacked, could last 6 months or more. Onions hung in mesh bags or braided ropes stayed dry and firm from harvest through March or April. This was not a backup plan, it was the plan. The root cellar itself held the crops that could survive in cold and damp. But a working storage system went far beyond the cellar. A Depression-era family with a well-run homestead was operating multiple preservation methods simultaneously, each matched to the specific food it was meant to preserve. Canning was the backbone of the system for anything the cellar could not handle. Mason jars, the wide-mouthed glass jars with two-piece lids that became a fixture of American rural kitchens in the late 1800s, were filled with tomatoes, corn, green beans, peaches, pears, and dozens of other fruits and vegetables through the hot, relentless work of late summer. The National Park Service recorded that wartime guidelines recommended canning 85 to 115 quarts of produce per person in a household to carry a family through winter. For a family of 5, that was 400 to 600 quarts of jars, not a weekend project, a seasonal commitment spanning weeks of work. Green beans and cut corn were the most commonly canned vegetables, but Depression-era homemakers canned everything available: dandelion leaves, Swiss chard, collard greens, spinach, even radish tops. Nothing with nutritional value was dismissed as too humble to preserve. Those rows of half-gallon jars of yellow corn and red tomatoes on the cellar shelf, as one woman who lived through it recalled, looked like wealth, because they were. The jars lived on wooden shelves built along the cellar walls, labeled, organized, rotated, so that the oldest stock came forward as new batches went in behind it. The cellar was not a room you threw things into. It was a managed inventory. Meat was handled separately. Refrigeration, as we understand it, was not available. And meat that spoiled did not just mean a bad meal, it meant the loss of a resource that had cost months of work to produce. The smokehouse solved this. Almost every working farm in the early 20th century had one, a small, low structure, often built of logs or heavy planks, with hooks in the ceiling and a pit in the floor for the fire. After a hog was slaughtered in late November or early December, the cuts were rubbed with salt, packed in salt, and left to cure for several weeks. Salt draws moisture out of the meat and creates an environment hostile to bacterial growth. Once cured, the pieces went into the smokehouse and hung over slow, cool smoke, typically from hickory, apple, or oak, for days at a time. The smoke deposited compounds on the surface of the meat that inhibited bacterial growth and added the flavor that became inseparable from the idea of American country ham. A properly smoked and salt-cured ham could hang in a cool, dry space and remain good for a year or more. It was a food source that required no cold storage, no power, and no refrigeration to maintain. Salt pork was another staple. Fat pork packed tightly in salt in crocks or wooden barrels formed a durable supply. It was the foundation of countless Depression-era meals cut off in small pieces and rendered down to flavor beans and greens and cornbread. One crock of salt pork in the cellar represented months of flavored protein for a family that had little else. Fish, where available, was salted in similar fashion. In coastal and river communities, barrels of salt herring and salt cod were as fundamental to winter stores as the potato bin. Drying was the oldest preservation method and among the most practical for certain crops. Apples were peeled, cored, sliced thin, and hung on strings stretched across the kitchen ceiling or laid on wooden drying frames in the sun. Dried apple rings could be stored in cloth bags through winter and reconstituted in water for pies, puddings, and apple butter. Herbs cut from the kitchen garden, sage, thyme, rosemary, peppermint, were bundled and hung from the rafters of the porch to dry, providing flavor and medicine through the cold months. Beans were dried in the pod, then shelled and stored in cloth sacks or glass jars. Corn was dried on the cob, sometimes roasted first to concentrate the sugars, then shelled and stored for grinding into meal through winter. The principle behind drying is simple. Bacteria and mold need moisture to reproduce. Remove the moisture from a food, and the biology of spoilage stops. A properly dried apple ring can sit in a cloth bag in a cool, dark space for 6 months without deteriorating. No electricity required. No glass jar required. just air, time, and a warm enough surface to pull the moisture out. For dairy, milk, cream, butter, and soft cheese, neither the root cellar nor the smokehouse was the right tool. Dairy needed consistent cold, and it needed it quickly after production. The springhouse provided it, a small stone structure built directly over a natural spring or cold running creek used the constant flow of cold groundwater to keep crocks of milk and pats of butter at temperatures close to what a modern refrigerator produces. Crocks were set directly in the shallow water or on shelves just above it. The stone walls of the building held the cold air and shielded the interior from summer heat. In areas without a spring, the ice house performed a similar function. Ice cut from frozen ponds and rivers in January, packed in sawdust inside an insulated structure, could survive well into summer, providing cold storage for perishables through the warmer months when the root cellar was too warm for dairy. Neither of these required any energy beyond the labor of cutting and hauling ice once a year or the stonework of building over a spring. Both were in widespread use across rural America until electric refrigeration made them obsolete. The knowledge of how to build them, like much else in this system, largely disappeared within a single generation of that shift. What made this system work was not any single method. It was the planning that linked them together. A well-run homestead operated on a preservation calendar that ran from the first garden harvest in July through the hog slaughter in November and into the final cellar checks of December. Nothing happened accidentally. The timing of each task was governed by what needed to be done before it and what would follow after. July and August brought tomatoes and corn to peak, with canning sessions running for days at a time. September meant root vegetables harvested and cellared, and apples picked and sorted. The blemished ones went immediately to canning or cider, and the sound ones went to the apple section of the cellar. In October, squash and pumpkins cured in the autumn sun to harden their skins before storage, and late cabbage was pulled and either cellared whole or fermented into sauerkraut and stoneware crocks. November brought the hog slaughter, salt curing began, and the smokehouse was fired. December was for counting. Inventory was taken, gaps identified, and plans made for next year's garden to address whatever had run short. The woman running this system was not improvising. She was managing a food supply. She knew before winter set in how many jars of tomatoes she had, how many pounds of salt pork, how many bushels of potatoes. She could calculate whether it was enough and make adjustments before it was too late to make them. That discipline, the counted inventory, the planned calendar, the nothing left to chance approach was as important to the system as the cellar itself. Shortfalls discovered in December could sometimes be addressed through trade with neighbors. A family short on potatoes might exchange a crock of salt pork for a bushel from the farm down the road. These exchanges were not charity. They were part of a community-level food system in which neighbors' surpluses covered each other's gaps. The woman who kept careful track of her own stores also knew, roughly, what her neighbors had put by, and that mutual awareness created a resilience that no single household could have managed alone. If you are finding value in this, take a moment and subscribe. Each week, Heirloom Acres goes back into the practical systems that small American families used to feed themselves, knowledge that works just as well today as it did in 1935. One preservation method wove through the whole system and deserves its own consideration. Fermentation. Sauerkraut was the most common fermented food in the American farm kitchen, but it was far from the only one. Cucumbers became pickles and crocks of brine. Green tomatoes, pulled at the end of season before frost could take them, were packed in brine and fermented into a sharp, vinegary preserve. Whole cabbages were fermented in large stoneware jars, layered with salt, weighted down with flat stones to keep the vegetable submerged in its own brine, and left to ferment in the cool cellar through winter. Fermentation works because certain bacteria, specifically the lactobacillus family, produce lactic acid as they feed on the natural sugars in vegetables. That acid drops the acidity of the environment low enough that harmful bacteria cannot survive. The food becomes, in effect, self-preserving. It does not require heat. It does not require anything beyond salt and time. Once fermentation is established, a crock of sauerkraut in a cool cellar is stable for months. What fermented food provides beyond preservation is nutrition. Fermented vegetables retain their vitamins and in some cases increase their availability through the fermentation process. A family eating sauerkraut through winter was getting vitamin C at a time of year when fresh vegetables were completely unavailable. A fact that kept farm families healthier than their nutritional circumstances might otherwise suggest. The system didn't collapse from any single blow. It was dismantled piece by piece, each piece replaced by something easier. The electric refrigerator came first. At the start of the 1930s, only 8% of American homes had one. By 1950, the majority did. Suddenly, cold storage didn't require a cellar or an ice house or a spring house. It required plugging something in. The root cellar became redundant and began to be left out of new home construction. The supermarket followed. The growth of chain grocery stores through the 1940s and the 1950s, stocked with canned goods produced industrially and increasingly with frozen foods, made home canning seem unnecessary. Why spend August in a hot kitchen filling jars when you could buy a can of corn at the store? The answer was that the store might not always be there, that the can might not always be affordable, that the knowledge of doing it yourself was worth more than any convenience. That argument was not compelling in times of plenty. The smokehouse disappeared when commercial cold cuts became cheap and widely available. The drying frames disappeared when the grocery store carried dried fruit year-round. The spring house was abandoned when the refrigerator replaced it. The fermentation crocks were put in storage and eventually thrown away. Within 2 generations, a complete food preservation system that had fed American rural families through some of the hardest years in the country's history had become a set of niche hobbies practiced by a small minority and regarded by most people as quaint remnants of a harder past. Look at it whole. And the root cellar system was not just a collection of preservation techniques. It was a relationship with food that assumed nothing would be wasted, that the labor of summer was the insurance of winter, and that a family's security depended on its own ability to put food by rather than on any outside supply chain. That relationship, with its meticulous inventory, its seasonal discipline, its half-dozen interlocking methods each matched to the food it was best suited for, represented a form of practical intelligence that took generations to develop and less than 1 generation to abandon. The root cellar still works. The physics of it have not changed. Soil still stabilizes at the same temperature. Salt still draws moisture from meat. Lactic acid still preserves cabbage. Mason jars still seal. None of the technology required is complicated or expensive. What has changed is the knowledge of how to use it and the habit of planning far enough ahead to need it. A family who stocks a root cellar in autumn is not being old-fashioned. They are doing something that a great deal of human history regarded as the most basic form of self-reliance, making sure the summer's work was enough to carry them through winter on their own terms, without depending on anyone else to keep the lights on or the shelves stocked. The system worked. It fed families through the Depression, through war years, through drought and bad harvests, and every kind of hardship the 20th century produced. It was not replaced by something better. It was replaced by something more convenient. Convenient, as most people who lived through the Depression understood better than anyone, is not the same thing as secure.